How should the West respond to China's dominance in critical minerals and their willingness to use this dominance as an economic weapon? Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Money Macro Talks, where I, Joeri Schasfoort, an economist, talk to guests that can help us understand what's going on in the global economy today. Today I'm talking to Dr. Tobias Gehrke, an expert in geoeconomics. Tobias is a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, so he's really in the thick of it. Tobias, welcome to the show. Before we get into that central question, can you maybe just fill us in? What are critical minerals and how have they become so crucial to the current geoeconomic competition between China and the West?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Joeri. Great to be here. Look, there's not one definition of what is a critical mineral. There's governments around the world who have collected lists of minerals and materials and ores that they think are quite important. And so everyone has a bit of a different definition. The Europeans have different definitions to the Americans or the Japanese and the Indonesians. But generally speaking, governments believe there's some materials, between 30 or 50, mined materials and processed materials that are more important than others, because these materials are almost like the skeleton of the economy. Without them, basically nothing works. They need to hold up the economy. They're the base foundation of a lot of industries, whether it's the defense industry, the energy utilities, whether it's microchips or any other electrical equipment. All of them require some form of mineral from the ground. And if you don't have these minerals, if you don't have access to them, you're in trouble. And that access was not a problem for some years. Access was good enough. But as you just introduced, the question of who has access to some of these minerals is now in question. And that's why governments trying to rush and say, okay, which ones maybe do we not have access to enough? And these ones may be more critical than others. So let's focus on them.
All right. That's already very interesting because I didn't know that. I was doing my research and I went, of course, the first hit was the American definition of critical minerals. So I didn't know that other countries had other definitions. Are there big differences or is it just like minor ones?
No, these are minor differences. There's some that you find on almost all lists. Let's say minerals that we know we need in the defense industry or in the microchip industry. Everyone would agree that these are critical. These are things like gallium, germanium, graphite, these kinds of materials, and the processing of these materials, they go into a lot of defense equipment and into the microchip industry, for example. So I think these you would find on most lists. Rare earth elements, a group of different materials, minerals, 17 of them, many of which you will also find on the lists of the Japanese, the Chinese, the Europeans, and so on. But there are some minor differences here and there, which relates to maybe specific industries that not every country has the same ones of, or whether there's domestic availability in some countries and not in others. So if you don't have any domestic availability for a certain material, it's likely you will find it more critical than if you actually do have availability domestically. So there's minor differences, but I think on the big ones, most agree. There's minerals, as I said, for defense and critical technologies, and there's particularly the minerals for the energy transition. Right, the things that you need to build batteries and wind turbines, and that's things like lithium, of course, and nickel. There's copper. Copper is sort of the wiring of our entire energy grid, right? If we want to build out the energy grid, which we have to do, we'll have to spend hundreds of billions to electrify our economies. You will need a lot of copper, lots of it. And so these are things that most would agree on. But each of them, of course, have their own dynamic and their own little market, and they're very different. Some of them are very niche minerals, and some of them are traded and mined in vast capacities. Like copper is a huge market, and other minerals are tiny markets. Only a couple $100 million are traded globally, or a couple $1 billion. So we lump them all together to make somehow sense of it. But of course, the reality is when you look into these markets and into these materials, that they differ quite significantly.
Yeah, and so I could imagine that these differences still come from a couple of categories that are all the same. Like, for example, I could imagine the risk of being cut off from these, the economic damage that they cause. There must be some. Are these the two main ones that bind these things together?
Yeah, exactly. Is there a risk that you are being cut off through a crisis, or of course through a government just restricting them? That's definitely one big concern. There's also just general scarcity questions. Do you have enough of that given the scale of the energy transition? So even though no one might want to cut you off from copper,
Hmm.
and it's globally mined and there's different production, it's just there's some concern that in order to scale the energy transition to the point we want, to put a lot of new transition wires into our grid, to put the solar plants and the solar installations and the wind installations to connect them to the grid, you're going to need so much copper. There's also some concern that if governments don't have a look at that to make sure that there's enough supply, we're going to come into a supply crunch, and then we can't electrify as quickly maybe as we would like, or can't bring as many lithium batteries online as we would like. So yes, it's both a concern of just general capacity. Do we have enough? Do we need to do more? And the question of weaponization, access, blocking of access. These are the two main concerns.
Yeah. And then when I was starting to do my research into this, one thing that I immediately came across when deeping a little bit deeper is, okay, when I say to someone on the street, critical minerals, I think most people would think of mining immediately. But as I understood it, one of the biggest challenges is actually in refining. So not mining per se. Um, can you tell us a little bit about that dynamic? Is that true, or is there more to it? Is it about both?
No, that is very important, and um, mining takes place generally across the world in many different locations. Mines are being opened and maintained. But indeed, once you get the ore, the mineral out of the ground, you need to do something with it. And usually that means processing or refining in some way. The refining process for different materials is different. But generally speaking, it's two things. It's very energy intensive. So you need a lot of electricity, cheap electricity, and it's usually environmentally damaging. For some of them, it is extremely damaging. You will need a lot of a big chemical mix to clean, to wash off the actual mineral that you want. They come in clusters of all sorts of things. And in order to get the one you want, you need to wash off the rest. That usually requires chemicals. How do you treat these chemicals afterwards? For some of them, like rare earths, heavy rare earths and light rare earths, the processing includes radioactive waste.
Mm.
That's kind of nasty, and no one wants that stuff. So getting the things out of the ground is a challenge, but is done all over the place. Processing is something that few countries like, especially in the West. And there is a huge concentration where China has attracted a lot of the processing industry over the last 30, 40 years. And that's where the huge concentration now sits. And so China has, for many minerals, the biggest choke point is on this refining capacity because uh, uh, environmental regulations in China have been over the years much more lax. And China usually has also lots of energy that it makes available for these things.
Mm.
That's a big difference.
Yeah. So, okay, then I think the global attention on this issue has been building up, right? But the thing that now really pushed it over the edge, maybe we could say why we are talking even, is that China started to control rare earths to the US and Europe. They already did it a couple of years ago just to Japan, is my understanding. But now they started introducing controls. Is that to Europe and the US as well, and maybe also globally? Is that on the refining side only, or is that on the mining and refining side?
Yeah, these latest controls is on rare earth elements, refined rare earth elements, so the products that you get out of the minerals, and products that then are made out of this. the main product that is made out of refined rare earth is our permanent magnets. So basically just very strong magnets. The whole permanent magnets, you're going to need them in a lot of things, basically everything. Every industry needs some form of permanent magnets, whether it's the automotive industry, the electric vehicle industry, the wind industry, the defense industry. All of them require these permanent magnets. And so once you get the rare earths out of the ground, you need to refine it and treat it. And then you make, let's say, 2 steps further down, you make these permanent magnets. All of them are made in China. China holds a global share of rare earth refining and permanent magnet production, somewhere around 95%. And so all of these products are now put under an export control in China, meaning you need a license. You need to go to Beijing and say, hello, I'm Volkswagen. I need that permanent magnet. Do I get a license? Of course, that puts huge pressure on companies to now get these licenses. And why has China used this? Yeah, China has realized over the last couple of years that this is a very strong geoeconomic weapon. It has used it to respond to what it believes the US and to a lesser degree other G7 countries have done to China itself, which is to weaponize their supply chains. And the fact that the Netherlands restricted export of semiconductor lithography machines a few years ago under pressure from Washington. China had already responded in 2023 by restricting graphite, germanium, gallium to the Netherlands, to the US, and to Japan. And that was quite a powerful move. And the leadership in Beijing realizes that this is a powerful weapon. They have used it sparingly so far, but when President Trump came to power, the trade escalation saw China react by drawing its sharpest sword, and that was rare earths and permanent magnets. And that resulted in the crisis that we're in today.
And so I really want to ask you next about a little bit more broadly, what is geoeconomics? Because I think that's a fairly new thing for many people. But right before that, I just want to first ask you this weapon, a geoeconomic weapon, China restricting permanent magnets and rare earths. How catastrophic is it, worst case scenario? Say, for example, China invades Taiwan and the European Union hits China with sanctions in response. What if China then cuts off the European Union from these things? Boom, completely. Are we then on a scale of magnitude looking at another Europe is being cut off from Russian gas? That kind of bad, or worse, or less bad? If you can say that at all. But
yeah, I think definitely not less bad, probably worse as of today.
Yeah.
Right? Today, if this would happen today, our industry is not prepared. Vast elements of our base industry in Europe, but also in other places, rely on access to permanent magnets, most importantly. So if that would stop tomorrow, quite frankly, some of these industries, like the automotive industry, would grind to a halt. There would be no more production very quickly. That would have incredible cascading effects. Imagine that 13 million people are employed in the car industry in Europe. Imagine 95% of them would stop production. I mean, we're talking an economic crisis of historic proportions. So yes, it is serious. Plus the defense industry that is less reliant, or let's say they need less of these products. It's a more niche product for defense industry, but still they do require some of these rare earth products. And so our ability to scale our defense industry, our ability to support Ukraine in its war with Russia is conditioned by Chinese export controls. So it is very serious. I hope we don't ever have to test this hypothesis, whether it's more or less or equally serious as the energy crisis with Russia, but it is really important.
And then, of course, especially given that China also dominates many of the other critical minerals as well, right? Like if they would also block off, you were only talking about rare earths, they only also block off, I don't know where they have the most leverage, but I read lots of also refining capacity in lithium, cobalt maybe, then the damage would be even greater, right?
That's right. Yeah. I think the other big damage would be on the semiconductor supply chain. It would probably be around germanium, gallium. These things are more niche, small markets, but they are vital to quite a few of these advanced electronics. That would probably bite China in the ass as well, let's say. So it's much more maybe of a double-edged sword. But there too, the damage could be. But the immediate crisis is certainly around rare earths, and that's where policymakers are also focusing.
So before we started our conversation, you told me that you actually watched one Money Macro video, which was about the Nazi war economy. And I think in that video, I also discovered like how common it was back in the Second World War to use economic weapons to manipulate your opponents, and also how that was so important that it really influenced policymakers to, maybe even invade other countries. Like, for example, arguably Germany invaded Eastern Europe because of access to critical resources, which were at the time, well, copper is maybe also a critical mineral, but mostly non-minerals. It was more about oil, but still, and we are not used to that anymore, right? Like today, just 10 years ago, it was just the market determines everything. If you want to buy minerals and it's restricted, or like if it's in short supply, the price will go up for everyone at the same, and the highest bidder will buy. And that was a great arrangement maybe for the West, which was relatively rich. So that was international economics back then. And now we are seeing more and more attention to geoeconomics. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about what is geoeconomics? You did your PhD thesis on this. And how is it different from the economics that we used to think about?
Yeah, I mean, you already started outlining the contrast to how is it different to the, let's say, classic global economy ideas that we have had for the last couple of decades. And that's a good place to start to contrast it, right? Because in this globalized economy that we know and have inhabited for a couple of decades, what mattered is really how efficient markets are, right? The guiding idea of economic policy is let's create as efficient as market as possible, because the more efficient the market is, the more welfare gains it will produce. And that at the end of the day is the best thing. If we produce more welfare gains for everyone, we'll all be better off. It's great. And so we created this system that basically followed this basic principle. It doesn't really matter where things are produced. What matters is how efficient they're produced. And if China produces them the cheapest, then that's good for you and me, because we get cheaper products and we have more spending power and we have more welfare. So geoeconomics is quite different. I think there the driving idea is that it matters actually who produces, where things are produced, who has control over and who has access to critical assets. And states believe that some assets are more critical than others, from raw materials to some technologies, data, critical infrastructure. So in a geoeconomic world, states are defining this sort of industries and supply chains that basically are not governed under market principles anymore. So they are much more willing to intervene, to manipulate, to change in order to have more control and access over these critical areas. And raw materials is a prime example of this, as are some other advanced technologies like semiconductors. But raw materials is a prime example where we have the idea that just having access to cheap materials has completely reverted. And now the geoeconomic idea has taken over that we need to have control over some of the supply. We have to have ensured access, and we have to make sure that we're not being weaponized against from others. So it's a very different mindset. The key objective of what economic policy should do in a geoeconomic world is different. The state is more willing to intervene, to manage risk and manage supply chains in certain sectors. Even though that might come at a cost to efficiency, there's more of a benefit, a perceived benefit anyway, to security and resilience. And so that's the main contrast in the big picture. And you see this in all sorts of industries: raw materials, semiconductors, quantum, telecommunications, infrastructure, shipping, where the state is now taking a closer look. hang on, who actually controls these assets? What is my position? Do I make myself vulnerable if I don't have a minimum level of manufacturing, minimum level of control over these? And if that is the case, I need to intervene and I need to manage or somehow shape these markets. And I think that is the basic idea. And raw materials is a key example.
And can we maybe use that framework to have a look at the players that are important right now? And then if we restrict ourselves to the most important critical minerals, I would imagine China is the country who started it all. I'm not saying, I did read, although, that actually some of China's refining dominance can be traced back to them being denied some Western assets and therefore having to develop some of this themselves. So maybe it's a bit mean to put all of this on China, but I do think that at least in the West we were far more dominated by sort of the liberal economic ideology, and the recent history on critical minerals, at least, maybe comes from China. So I would argue they're the player maybe to look at first. In your geoeconomic framework, do you know how they are looking at the world, or how would you say they are looking at the world? They are very dominant maybe in some minerals, but not in all. How would you analyze the current position of China?
The current position is very much dominance, one of dominance across the board. Yes, we are not in all 30 or 50 minerals, but in many of the key ones. Now, how did we get here? And Chinese leadership had its role to play. There's this famous quote from Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese reformer, 1980s, who said, the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. So this idea that this is a market that is quite strategic because these materials are used for so many things like oil was very clear. And then China has this other important idea that is a red thread through its history, all the way back to Mao Zedong, this idea of self-reliance. It's an idea that Mao had pushed very heavily in the 1980s, often with huge consequences, to just be self-reliant, to not rely on Western or foreign technology or any sort of inputs. It was detrimental in many regards, and it lost some of its traction in the following decades. But in the last 2 decades or so, this idea that China needs to be self-reliant, that it needs to have control certain capabilities, raw materials, manufacturing of advanced technologies, that is the foundation to power in the international economy. That is very strong. And you see it in all sorts of Chinese strategic documents. We need to have a level of control over this industry, over that industry, a minimum level of manufacturing, a control of the entire supply chain, not just the end product, but the entire supply chain. This is very strategic thinking that the Chinese leadership has been doing for many decades. And you see it in many raw materials, not just in the raw materials, but also in the downstream products. And so what China has done is in the 1980s and 90s attract a lot of foreign investment and talent and know-how into the mineral space. That used to be also very much a European and Western industry in France, Germany, Portugal, Spain. All of them had strong mineral mining industries and know-how, and much of it was then basically attracted. China gave credits, tax credits. It gave lax environmental protections. A lot of that know-how came to China. China built it up, managed to basically become self-reliant. And not only that, it made also others dependent on China. And so it's a key example of how these big ideas, these geoeconomic ideas that Chinese leadership is nourishing, how they can be successful, how they have managed with a lot of state guidance and industrial policy over many decades, how they've managed to gain control over certain supply chains and now reap the benefits of being able to using them in a geoeconomic way by saying, if you do this or if you don't do this, I will not supply you. And so, yeah, it's a geoeconomic gamble that has not been around only for a couple of years, but for a few decades, but it's paying off. And you can imagine that in other sectors, in other industry, a similar dynamic is unfolding.
Yeah, that's That's very interesting. I think in the latest 5-year plans that they're very strongly discussing self-reliance in every industry, and they're moving to more advanced ones. But okay, critical minerals, they're already there, is the impression I'm getting from you. And then could it be accurate to say their problem now in geoeconomic terms is not about gaining dominance, but it's about how do we use this to maximize our, other political benefits without maybe getting a too strong reaction from the West or the world, where the world quickly adapts to maybe in 2 years not be reliant on China anymore. Is that could you say that's their central geoeconomic mineral problem right now?
Yeah, that's very well put. And so far they succeeded. Uh, and now we're at a point where we have to see whether they have not overplayed their hand. But so far, as you said earlier, it's not the first time that China has weaponized some of these mineral supply chains. You mentioned, I think, the example with Japan in 2010, but there were other smaller examples, also with Europe in 2023 with the Dutch, with the Swedish government, specific on graphite, for example. There was an export ban on graphite to Sweden in particular over Swedish ambitions to challenge China's battery industry. So China
Mm.
has played this, but before these cards, but very smartly. You don't target everyone at the same time. You target some, but not others. You create divisions in between European countries, for example, or between industry. So some in the semiconductor industry will receive them, others will not. So you can't. So you create these divisions and different lobby groups, and so far it has been quite successful that China has played these cards, but never too much to create this counter movement. Now, since October, when it has really escalated many of its control and has added also new features like extraterritorial applications of these laws, that means that any company in the world that uses any sort of Chinese raw material product is captured. So, example, if you're a South Korean battery maker, Samsung, for example, and you want to build a battery plant in the Netherlands, chances are you're going to have some form of Chinese battery technology in this plant. Some sort of machine that cuts the battery cells into smaller cells or something like this. Those machines are made with some form of rare earth, and therefore they are controlled. And therefore, Samsung has to go to Beijing and say, hello, I'm building this plant in the Netherlands. Can I use your machine? And China can just say, nope. So this is a massive extension of how these controls work. It is a massive escalation, in other words. And therefore, we are now in a different dynamic where it is indeed possible that Europeans and Japanese and Americans and others will say, wow, this is not sustainable. We need to now go all in on getting rid of this dependence.
Yeah, and before getting into, it's very interesting, how and whether or not they can get rid of this dependence, I'm just curious to ask a little bit more about, is this even possible to do this? Because when you say this, I'm thinking about the Western oil embargo, for example, or Western sanctions against Russia. And, they've certainly done their damages, but it's also very much written about that it's quite easy to find a way around these. Shouldn't this dynamic, this very economic dynamic, also hold for China? That, like, how can China police all these firms? Can't they easily just tell China, oh yeah, we're not doing that? But then, how can China see if a Chinese machine is shipped to the Netherlands rather than to Korea?
Yeah, that's a good point. How to implement, how to enforce it rather, would be big question marks. And if China would really play out this card on a massive scale, indeed, I think you would see a lot of transshipment and circumvention, just like you described it, we see on other sanctions regime that are at this scale. Nonetheless, I think the threat is serious, nonetheless, even if there would, after some months, be new routes and, the black market will establish some transshipment route via some other channel. The impact would be, I believe, potentially so immediate because there are few stockpiles that you would have immediate pressure, as we now saw already in October, immediate pressure on the industry here, immediate pressure to say, if we don't get this now in the next 2 weeks, we will stop production. And so that makes it, I think, a credible weapon, a credible threat. But indeed, if they would pull it all the way, I think the efforts to de-risk, to diversify away would skyrocket. And in the end, of course, we're recording this in late November. China has withdrawn or paused some of these controls, right? There was a détente with the US for the time being. We don't know exactly the details of how this will work and where Europe will fare in this equation. But the worst has been avoided for the moment, at least for 12 months. That's the time that this détente is supposed to last. But so it gives us some breathing room. But that breathing room now needs to be used in a good way.
Yeah. And okay, then to me, it's relatively clear for China. Then your analysis is okay, they're already dominant, but they're going to have to learn how to use this weapon without it being self-defeating in the end, or losing its value over time too quickly. And they're quite good at it seems, so far. So the most obvious country to ask after next is the US, but given your knowledge of Europe and also the examples that you mentioned, maybe we can turn to Europe first. How would you classify the European position in the geoeconomic game for critical minerals?
Bad. Not in a good spot. We have hypothetically, theoretically, there's quite a few mining deposits in Europe, quite diverse also, all over the place. But de facto, we're not mining almost anything in Europe at a meaningful scale for our industry. We're also not doing any kind of processing anyway.
Sorry to interrupt. So all of the processing that you mentioned, because you mentioned European countries being very strong at this, Portugal, France, Italy, I think you mentioned. It's all gone?
There used to be, yes. There used to be a strong mining industry in the 70s and 80s, but much of it moved out. It's now mostly artisanal mining. Right? There's some artisanal mining all over the place still, but for very high value things or just very specific, very niche kind of products. But this kind of scale mining that is economical also has mostly vanished. There's some here and there in Sweden and but it has vanished over the last couple of decades, and much of it has moved to other places. A lot of it to China, but also to other places. And with it has also gone a lot of the know-how, the engineers, the academics who actually build out this place. So China churns out hundreds of thousands of academics and PhDs in mining and geology, and in Europe it's a drop in the ocean. Yeah, and so even if you now want to reverse this, the deck is stacked against us. A lot of the intellectual property and tech development in the last 2 decades has taken place in China. China has by far the most intellectual property in mining technology, in processing technology, in permanent magnet technology, and so forth. So the cards are really stacked against us. So Europe, the position is quite clear. We cannot do this alone. We 100% need partners. Now, the good news for Europe is we have, in fact, allies, and many of the materials that Europe needs are, in fact, mined in G7 countries. So let's say the closest industrial allies, Australia and Canada, most importantly. Australia is the biggest producer of lithium in the world, but ships all of it to China. And the biggest market. But there are allies who have more expertise, who have mining at scale. So Europe's option in the big picture is how can we make sure that we help our allies scale also their production? How can we make sure that we build a processing, a refining, and industry together? That we invest in this together and that we all benefit from this. That's Europe's challenge. And that is also the path that Europe has broadly chosen. Yes, let's do some more in Europe, but also particularly what can we do internationally?
Yeah. And is that also for refining? Is the strategy mostly let's build a refining industry in one of our allied countries, whether it be Australia or Canada or Europe itself?
Yeah, I'd say the refining piece of the puzzle is less thought through yet. We have spent the last couple of years as Europeans really focusing on the mining, supply of mining particularly. So Europe has invested or supported all sorts of countries around the world, South Africa, Namibia, Indonesia, Australia, to help mining projects off the ground.
Yeah.
It has not done always very successfully because at the end of the day, you need money, and the Europeans are usually quite skimpy. And so they say, well, we help you with some regulatory stuff. And so they've really focused on the supply of mined materials. But indeed, the more important thing, actually, you could say, is the processing from a geoeconomic perspective anyway, because that's where Europe is the most vulnerable. And that is not really really thought through. Who will do that? Where will it happen? As I said, much of it is environmentally really nasty. Europeans will not want this, I can tell you, where no one wants to have this in their backyard. This will be NIMBYism, times 1 million. And so the question is, can we then rely on emerging economies to do this? Is this even, our interest that the environmentally bad stuff then happens in Namibia? That's also not a great look. So there's a lot of bad trade-offs we still haven't figured out. So Europe's raw material strategy is still a little bit in its unfinished form. And now it is really super challenged to quickly deliver. But when we haven't got all the pieces of the puzzle yet.
And then I also noticed this. Maybe we can now move to the US and maybe also and potentially later talk about the G7 allies, but the US first, America first, we could say. I also noticed with them, honestly, like I was looking at some of the proposals by Trump, by Scott Bessent, and they always focus on mining, and it struck me as being so weird. Like I read refining is a problem, and then all the MAGA or Trump proposals are about mining also. Is that also your impression, or have I just missed that? Are the Americans further than the Europeans when it comes to refining?
No, definitely. They are quite in a similar spot, I would say. There also have been efforts in the US for the last many years to do something about it, but nothing has really worked so far. And one of the key problems that has yet to be solved is the price differential with China. Let's say you take some money, take a subsidy. I have now 500 million euros and I will subsidize a mine, whatever, somewhere in the US or somewhere in Europe. So that mine will produce, then can build the mine with this investment, build the infrastructure there. But at the end of the day, it will produce a raw material or a process material even at a certain price. Someone needs to buy this, right? If this price is 30% more expensive than what a Chinese company is offering, who will buy it? The answer is, so far, no one, not enough. So the European industry, the downstream industry, the OEMs, the Volkswagens, the Vestas, the Rheinmetalls, and whatever, all these big industries that actually need the products, they don't really care enough about what they want is the cheapest product. So they're like, oh, it's good for you to subsidize a mine somewhere here in America, but yeah, if you can't produce it cheap enough, I will still buy Chinese. They don't say it like this, but this is de facto what is happening. So
Yeah.
what the Americans are now trying to figure out is, okay, this price gap needs to close. And what the Americans are doing is, okay, our policy so far has not worked. What we will do is now we will subsidize very heavily production. I will guarantee a miner somewhere in the US, I will guarantee that I will buy your product for the next 10 years at this price. Even if China then offers a lower price, I will always buy. I'm the government, I'm the Pentagon, the Department of War. I will buy your rare earths at price, let's say 100. And so even if the Chinese offer me to sell it at 70, I will not do that. And so you guarantee that there is demand. There's a guarantee for demand at a certain price that helps these miners and these processors, potential processors, to produce for some time. And then the government, the US government, is a big buyer. They buy for the entire defense industry. So they say, look, I'm buying basically at this price, and I have the customers because I will have the Lockheed Martins and so on, and they will buy it for this price. So they are doing really a more radical market intervention here. It is really a radical market intervention because they are completely saying this market is completely gone. I will upend this market, and I will intervene as a government and just set a price floor. This is the
Yeah.
price floor, and I will guarantee it for 10 years or something like this. And with that, I guarantee demand. The
Yeah.
Europeans are not that far yet. We haven't done anything like this. We just subsidize supply, but we haven't figured out this demand issue. And yeah, the question for Europe then, looking at America, is, well, is there something to learn here? Maybe our defense industry should also buy diversified raw materials. Maybe our electric vehicle industry needs to also buy diversified. Maybe we need to help them to do that. But the industry, of course, will say, if I have to buy a raw material that is more expensive, you will crush my competitiveness. I will then be more expensive. My final product will be more expensive. I have to ask a higher price to global consumers, and I will be punished. So you cannot make me pay something that is more expensive, buy something that is more expensive. It's a big conundrum. The point here is, bottom line, the Europeans haven't figured it out, how to fix the demand issue. The Americans also not, but the American government has now said, all right, we're going in. I will guarantee a defense market demand. And that's a pretty bold policy. And I think it could be more successful than what Europe has done so far.
But one thing I don't understand, this is rare earths probably, right?
Yes.
Where's the refining now? Because if you talking about, and they also talking about mines, okay, and then the defense industry buying, but it needs to be refined in between, right? Who's doing the refining in this American policy?
So they're trying to build up some refining capacity. And one interesting case is that there is, for example, refining capacity in Europe, in France in particular, at an artisanal scale. So the Solvay, a Belgian company, for example, they have a refining production line in the south of France. And there's another French company that also has one. Now, they've built a little bit of a refining capacity. They have some of the technology indigenously. Some of it they maybe buy Chinese. But they built these factories, and then they went to European consumers and said, hello, who wants to buy our refined rare earths? No one. And so they couldn't scale this. So they have a tiny little factory there, and they couldn't scale it because there's not enough demand. Now the Americans are coming in, and the Americans, because they have subsidized demand, there's now an American company who came to France and bought basically the output of Solvay and said, I will buy your output for 10
Okay.
years.
Yeah.
And with that, the Americans will get some processing and they can scale it, and it will all flow to America rather than Europe. But yeah, so, okay. I mean, this is just one little case study or case. But yes, the Americans haven't figured out everything. But let's say the bigger picture is that they're going in with a lot of money, with a lot of determination from the top. Things need to change. We will not let this up to the markets to decide the outcomes. We will go in. And too early to judge whether they will be successful, but it's clearly a different strategy to what Europe has done so far.
And are there any other big players that are relevant in this story? I read a little bit about Japan being a little bit ahead of the curve on this. Are there also others? Like I could imagine for India, this is also very important given they have border skirmishes with China, but I could also imagine it will be difficult for India to pull off given that they're not wealthy enough. Are there any other players out there that we need to talk about when it comes to the geoeconomics of critical minerals?
Yeah, Japan is important case, an important ally, because they have been coerced by China over rare earths in 2010. The Chinese strategy has been, since 2010, much more focused on how do we get out of this chokehold. And they have been marginally successful. They still, in 2010, they imported 95% of permanent magnets from China. Now it's something like 65%. So, it's better, but you could still say, well, not super successful. But they have made some interesting innovations. For example, they have set up this state entity, Geoeconomics it's called, that is a state body, a state bank almost, that invests in mining and processing around the world with government money, government loans, basically hands out loans. And it also, another thing it does is it stockpiles. It holds a stockpile of various materials. So if a crisis hits and you all of a sudden don't have access, Geoeconomics, this body, can release some of its stockpile and help divert the crisis.
Yeah. Okay.
And so something to learn here, because Europeans don't have many stockpiles. And so that's one good example.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's, because I think we're starting to get to our final question, which is how should the West respond? At first generally, and then maybe Europe. But I could imagine then stockpiles are part of the strategy. Investing in mining price floors and investing in processing. Maybe could that be sort of summarized into infant industry policy essentially, but then for mining and processing, because on their own they can't compete, and that's a very, very well-known problem in economics, right? But it's usually not applied to this, but more to advanced manufacturing when it comes to development economics. So yeah, could that be the strategy? Stockpiles in the short term and then infant industry policy in the long term. And should there at some point also be that tariffs are part of it, that we're saying, look, China is, because one problem we haven't talked too much about is that China is widely accused of subsidizing their industries on a very broad scale. And I could imagine that one of the Chinese strategies to go against these efforts to diversify away would be to then do a little bit what the Saudis did to the shale industry in the US, which is like flood the market with cheap products. Your industries that take 10 years to set up are gone. Try again in the next 10 years. So sorry, lots of information to talk about at once. So two questions here. Like, one is, what's the strategy look like for the West? And then two, how will China respond, and how should the strategy adapt?
Yeah, I think there's lots of elements that have to come together. You already mentioned most of them. Stockpiling has to be part of the agenda. Stockpiling costs money, though. So what we haven't figured out in Europe is who pays for it. Governments. So we do like the Japanese, have like a government stockpiling, or should the companies do it? And quite expensive to do. So yes, stockpile, but you cannot do it without money. That's one. Second element is, I think, innovation. A lot of things, maybe we don't need raw materials in it. There's a lot of advances innovation advances that try to substitute raw materials, scarce or critical raw materials, maybe for less scarce and less critical materials that are much more abundant. And there have been great breakthroughs. We also have to focus on that, as well as circularity. So most raw materials can be used again. You need to recycle them. That's another industry that we are in the infant. It's quite hard to scale. There's some technological challenges, economies of scale challenges. But Europe has a great opportunity to be a leader on recycling. So once all the first generation of electric vehicle batteries and wind turbines, once they come to an end of their life cycle in a few years, we have a chance to really scale up our recycling industry to get back many of these materials. It's a very important element. Third element, I think, yes, partnering. So let's really see who has these materials, who already has a processing industry that we can help to scale, maybe help co-invest, make sure our companies and financial actors invest in our partners to help scale what is already there. We don't have to do everything from scratch in Europe. We don't have to just compete ourselves. We also need to make sure that our partners have access to finance, access to our markets to help them scale. So there's also an element in this. So these are three elements. But the big one, and that's the one you mentioned at the end, it has to be, I think, also part of the strategy. So can you build a resilient supply chain while you're basically open to the Chinese market? China has, like you already described, this massive advantage of scale of subsidies that are everywhere, and Chinese products, raw materials will likely be cheaper, most of them for a long time or forever. And China, like you already described, will try to stay cheaper for as long as possible to underbid the market, to make sure everyone buys Chinese. The policy question that comes up from this is, can we build alternative supply chains, entirely alternative supply chains where China is not part of it? And that you can do with tariffs, yes, with price floors where you said, okay, for example, if you want to sell any sort of raw material or rare earth, let's say, in the European market, our cost of producing this raw material in Europe or in America or in Japan or in Canada is 100. So if you want to sell it here in Europe, you cannot sell it below 100. That's a price floor. It's like a tariff. And this way you ensure that an alternative supply chain has a chance to compete, has a chance to grow, the infant industry like you described.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're moving towards, a kind of a club approach where some Western countries will merge into, I believe, some sort of club where within the club you trade freely and you co-invest. But if you're outside of this club, particularly China, you will have market entry barriers. This is, I think, a realistic future for the next 5 years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes that makes total sense. Now, one problem I could see with it is that if you try to start up that club, China will respond aggressively by trying to divide and conquer, maybe trying to really cut some of the parts of this club off entirely from some of these rare earths. Would that be something to?
Yeah, that's a good point. Exactly. We don't operate in a vacuum. There's always action, counteraction. You have to war game things. You have to put scenarios of how others might respond. So it's a very good comment. And I think it's very true because we already see it. China has already now, in its export controls in October, has said they will not give a license if you want to stockpile that rare earth product. So if you say, hello, I need a license, can you please give this to me? But you need to demonstrate that you're actually going to use it right away. You need to demonstrate for what you're going to use it. But if you want to stockpile it, you're not going to get a license. So yes, that's already China trying to make sure we don't decouple or de-risk from China. Of course, China will choose the exact opposite strategy of making sure everything in its power and we continue to rely on it. So there's no easy answer, but I think there will be opportunities to de-risk from China in some way, not in this like from today to tomorrow, but it is not quantum computing. It is an industry that can be built in an alternative way. China has some advantages on scale, on some of the technology stuff, but it's not rocket science, right? Like you would call it. It is something that other countries used to be good in, where other deposits exist. You just need to create over some time the environment for an alternative market to develop. I think it's possible. But as we said already in the very beginning, every raw material will need a different kind of strategy. There's no one-fits-all strategy. I think in the next 12 months or in the next 12 to 36 months, let's say, the focus will be very much short-term, rare earths. We need to fix this problem as soon as possible. And some will be more mid to long-term. Copper, for example, is something where, we need more capacity generally. But we have some time, and we have some time to think about how we're going to scale this market, where can we channel investments. So there's no one-fits-all strategy. Different solutions will be found. Will have to be found. Rare earths being the first one.
Should other economic weapons be a part of this strategy and, maybe even in an extreme way? For example, and I'm still talking just from the perspective of the West, and we'll get to Europe a little bit after that, but for example, the US is, of course, as we know, very dominant in finance. China heavily relies on the US dollar still. They have so much reserves that are US dollar based. They've tried to shift it a little bit from the central bank, but now it's in Chinese state controlled banks. So actually, they're still very reliant on this. We have seen with Russia that the West, they're not innocent in geoeconomics. They've frozen Russian assets. Could it be part of the strategy that the West says, well, look, if we are going to develop this critical Earth industry, if China responds by cutting a member off from critical Earths or anything else, the West will respond by freezing Chinese reserves. It doesn't have to be that specific weapon, right? But the West has some leverage also in some other sectors still. I could even imagine this becoming a little bit like a NATO of geoeconomics, in the sense that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Maybe first, could that be part of the strategy? And then second, should it be? Or is that too extreme? Could also be too extreme of a response, right?
My personal view is yes, on both accounts. It should be, because we are in this world where the great powers will leverage and weaponize these dependencies quite openly. It used to be a bit hush-hush in the last couple of years. You would never admit that you actually leverage something. Now it's very open. Both China and the United States, for that matter, use these weaponizations in a most open way. And I think we in Europe in particular need to prepare for this and think not just how can we de-risk some of these dependencies, but more short-term, how do we respond to crisis? And I think to have also economic deterrence, like in the Cold War it was nuclear deterrence, is something that we need to build. If you do X, I will do Y. And our Y needs to be very large and painful, because you want to escalate in order to de-escalate. And then your second question is that even possible? Do we have this kind of leverage? I think we do, at least on paper. You need, first of all, on paper to have the actual leverage. I think Europe also does, particularly if Europe would ally with Japan and the United States. We have technology advantages still that China relies on in aerospace, for example. And there's parts and engines and Airbus as a general company that is almost indispensable. Without it, China's air industry would not function. Imagine Europe would say, in response to China threatening to cut rails, imagine Europe would respond and say, and then we will cut off the maintenance and servicing of Airbus aircraft in China. It would be huge. But I think whether this is the example or not, right? You said the finance example, financial sanctions on the US side, we need to think in these terms. Now, Europe is currently not able to do that. Our politics are not there yet, but we need to prepare for this world, I believe, where this will become the norm. Coercion is already and is becoming the norm, and you need to strike back or threaten to strike back. This mutual ensured destruction was the term during the Cold War, right, on nuclear. And it has to be, the analogy in the economic world is this mutually assured economic destruction, if you will. We don't want to destruct ourselves, but if we don't push back, I'm afraid we will be coerced many times over in the next coming years. And so we have to prepare for that.
And maybe then a broader question. We've talked about a broader geoeconomic question. We've talked about China with their next 5-year plan, wanting, essentially, they are going for autarky in every industry. Given that this is the case, like, we don't want, speaking from a European perspective, we clearly don't want, we like the old world, to trade with China openly, to trade with the US openly, to trade with everyone openly. Is China, purely by that strategy, forcing our hands to pursue the same strategy broadly? So not just in critical minerals and how to respond to that, or to just respond to coercion. That is already broad. That's what you just mentioned. But also, should we have our own autarky strategy, maybe as a bloc, as a Western bloc, vis-a-vis China, that is extremely broad, that is just across the spectrum, purely because they are doing it? Should we do that as well?
Yeah, I think, let's say, autarky as a policy sounds, first of all, like a terrible idea, but the broad direction that you sketch, I think, is definitely something we need to consider. The weaponization is the one thing, but you rightly say China's economic growth model is also at the expense of our growth. China's economic growth is all based on gaining more market shares in manufacturing and manufacturing exports, and export. And that is at the cost of our industry that also exports is also our economic model. So there is I think, a clear trade-off for us. And we need to, I think, check this much more seriously. I don't think, maybe autarky is the right word, but I think we need to identify quite clearly in which sectors do we want to remain globally open, also to China, which will be most sectors, by the way. I don't think we need to be autark in toys and other such things, right? But what we need to get better at is identifying which sectors and supply chains are really important and strategic, where we need at least some capacity, where we don't want to be fully dependent on a systemic rival. And that yard of sectors is growing, and the challenge is to have, to define this yard in a good way that is not totally recklessly protectionist, but also not totally naive to think nothing is really strategic. Clearly, more things are strategic than just defense industry. Raw materials being one of them, several technologies and industrial inputs being more. So we need to find that golden balance somewhere. And Europe is trying that for some years, but we don't really agree in Europe what is strategic and what isn't, what is critical and what isn't. We have been debating this for years and years and years, and we need to have more clarity on which things we need to maybe shut ourselves off from China and build alternative supply chains, like in raw materials, and where not.
And yeah, of course, we've been talking about China a lot because we're talking about critical minerals. But what about the US? Like, just going to a final part of our conversation, I think let's turn to Europe completely. US has shifted strategy dramatically when it comes to international economics under Trump. Europe has noticed for sure. How would you say that Europe should view the US when compared to China? Because you could also take the point that Trump has been a lot of bluster. It's not that serious, right? Maybe. I'm not saying it is, but maybe there will be a new government in the US in a couple of years. A lot of these things are very long term. How do you think Europe should look at its rivals? What are its rivals and what are clearly allies?
Yeah, in many regards, the US and China in the big picture and geoeconomics are quite similar. They subscribe to very similar ideas. This idea that you need to control directly manufacturing, technologies, supply chains, data. Both subscribe to this idea, and they are implementing policies to take control. Both are also subscribing to this idea that you can weaponize. If others are dependent on you economically or technologically, you should leverage that and weaponize it. So I think in the big picture, they're quite similar, and Europe has to ask itself the same questions as it is with the Americans. Where do we need to really de-risk some of the dependencies we have on the US, particularly on defense and on tech, like cloud computing? And where is also economic exchange with the US still beneficial, even though it's not as it was 10 years ago? We still need also an American market, even if it's closing a little bit. So I think the same lessons sort of that we have with China, we need to be quite clear-minded of what things are really critical and strategic for us and what things are not, applies here. But generally speaking, we are living in a world of Europe lives in a world of triple coercion, right? US, China, Russia, all of them use their leverages against Europe. And we cannot wish it away, but we will have to learn to fight these kinds of geoeconomic wars on different fronts at the same time. It would be a fallacy for Europe to think that because things are very difficult with the US right now, we should go along with China. I think that would be a fallacy. The Chinese economy is systemically different to Europe's. It's challenging us. So we cannot flee from one to the other. And the same applies the other way around. We should not flee blindly into believing that we need to integrate fully with the US market just because things are getting worse with China. So it's a very difficult spot, but I think for Europe, the basic homework has to be this decision: what things matter the most? Where do we need to have an independent European industry, or at least a semi independent supply chain that makes us less vulnerable to coercion, and then go all in on these. And raw materials and rare earths is one of them. And I think on the yes side, cloud is another one. And we need to double down on these.
Yeah. I think that is something that's really a perfect end to our conversation, honestly. Like, we've ended at Europe, where you're based, where you're advising, I think, Europe on these matters. And I'm very happy that you are advising them on these matters, because it clearly sounds to me like this is a huge priority. It's just such a shift in thinking compared to just 5-10 years ago. And I just want to stress, because you also mentioned, when I use the word autarky, I used it intentionally, because it's in economics, it's a bad thing. Everybody knows you don't want autarky for a good economy. This will make life much more expensive for everyone, and it's really not what we want. But I don't think we have a choice. And from our conversation, I've already learned a lot. For me, the key takeaways are that the dependence on critical minerals is way more serious than the mainstream public still think it is what I think. I know econ nerds like me are looking into this, but just by comparing it to the Russia shock from gas, and then, thinking about that it could very well be quite a bit worse, it should be a huge wake-up call to non-economic nerds, so just the general public as well, because we have seen how much that impacts just the cost of living. And then my other key takeaway is that, yeah, China is dominant. They have been thinking about this for a very long time. The West needs to catch up, even if it doesn't want to, even if we go into this saying, look, we want China to be rich. We have nothing against China, but they're forcing our hands by, one, being so dominant, and then two, now having clearly shown that they are willing to use this as an economic weapon, as a means of coercion. And then three, the strategy to do this will be very difficult. We're not there yet at all. We're focusing on mining. We're not focusing on refining enough. We need allies to do it. You can't do it alone. And you need a lot of state intervention to do this. And you need to be willing to use all of the tools of industrial policy. Subsidies, price floors is something I haven't talked about too much on the channel yet, because it's just so new again. It used to be a very well-known economic tool, I think, just along with price controls, but also potentially tariffs. Like what you said was, can we rebuild this industry on our own when being open to Chinese rare earth industry? Maybe we do need tariffs, even though it's clear that this has huge economic costs. And then finally, as Europe, we need to be wary about other sectors as well, not just critical minerals. And we need to have a grand geoeconomic strategy that is also wary of the US, not just China. Am I forgetting something from our conversation?
That's an excellent summary. Really, couldn't have done it any better.
Okay, thank you. Now, Tobias, thank you so much for speaking to me about this, because I am an econ nerd, but this is a whole new field for me as well, and I will make a video about this. And I'm really looking forward to see some of the reactions on the full podcast here. Thank you so much for coming on, Tobias, and all the best. I hope you can come on again at some point.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Really enjoyed this.